This time it didn't take me 7 days to return to my table. In fact, it only took me 2. It's hardly enough to set a precedent or a pattern by, but I will take it for the victory that it is. I've noticed when I do voiceovers that I'm trying to speak so clearly and conscientiously that I inadvertently slip into my customer service voice, which is far more polite than I am, and a little higher pitched. Please bear with me. Hopefully one day I'll be a little bit more comfortable. But I figured while I wait for these guys to cure, I would work and see about turning these into teeth. So I have equipped this bit. I don't know if this is going to be the one to pick, but you know what? We're going to find out. A good note here is if you're a tea drinker like me, now is the time to cover your tea so that you don't get epoxy dust in there. So before I begin, because this is going to get rather loud, so basically what I did for this tooth, the way I do this is I keep the top rounded, but it's kind of like a soft triangle. Soft on this side, but comes to a point here, if that makes sense to you. That's kind of how I operate. So we're gonna try weathering this. Let's see how it works, right? Okay. So a question you might be asking is, wouldn't I save a lot more time if maybe I did a lot more sculpting or refining of the shape before the epoxy cured? And yes, that is absolutely accurate, and I could have done that. But lately, my motivation and attention span has been, lacking. So having the presence of mind to return to the teeth, I don't know, 20, 30, 45 minutes later when it's set up a little bit more and can handle a little bit more of a rough touch and keep itself in one piece is, well, out of my pay grade. Besides, I really do like this sanding process. If there's one thing I always typically really enjoyed, it was art history, and specifically when we got to Greek and Roman statuary. And the one thing that always amazed me was that these artists sculpted by subtraction. So they would take this block of marble and just whittle it down into some magnificent structure. I remember I went on a school trip. I think it was actually for college. I can't quite remember, but it was to the art museum in New York City, and I saw the statue of Laocoon and Sons. I'll see if I can dig up a picture and pop it here for you. But it was enormous, and the detail, I mean, you could see the guy's veins protruding in his arms, and just the ability to see that form in the marble and not mess it up has always been just, it's magic. They are magicians. You can't tell me it's not magic. I don't believe you if you say it's not. But I like the hands-on quality of shaping each tooth. Each tooth will be different and weird, and yeah, that kind of does it for me. All right, let's check out contestant number 1. So we're getting there in terms of the shape, but this bit wasn't really the one to use. It was pretty slow going, and I wasn't really getting the results that I wanted. It's probably not the bit I should have been using, but live and learn. So what I ended up switching to was a sandpaper bit. I did have this out into the side, but I was worried about using it initially because I've used sandpaper bits before, and they've become a little ineffective because they get really clogged up with dust. However, today that didn't happen. I ended up switching here after this tooth and using it on the remaining 7 with absolutely no trouble. It's probably a dead bit of sandpaper now, but it definitely did the job the entire time. The other benefit of using the sandpaper bit is that it left a wonderfully coarse texture on the tooth. These wonderful little lines that I'd be filling in with paint. You can see here on the polymer clay tooth that I made, I have all these lines and grooves and divots in it. which are great to sink paint into. Basically, we'll be doing a wash of dark paint and then wiping the paint off, leaving only the dark paint in the cracks. This is a voice from the future. Well, that's not entirely accurate. It is several days later, from the latitude and longitude of my bedroom floor, and I am attempting to edit this thing. I'm trying to do a good job. It should be tattooed on my forehead. I struggle with wondering if this is worth it. I have hardly the effort for a lot of things, and I'm trying to do this. It's a large undertaking, but as doubtful of myself as I can be, I do have to acknowledge that in the weeks preceding the start of this experiment, that I really hadn't made anything at all, or been working on anything. I thought about making stuff. I cleaned my room and prepared my table like I could make stuff, but then I didn't. And I certainly didn't work on the same thing more than once, especially to this kind of serious degree. So, in that respect, it has been a success. So, if you're watching, thank you. I have a work apron that I haven't worn for any part of this so far. But I used to get an enamel pin to put on it, when enamel pins started becoming like a huge thing on Instagram and stuff. So that every time I finished a project, I would get a pin and put it on my apron. I think I might empty my apron and start again from scratch, if I can finish this mask. It might be a fun idea. I think I like that idea.
Okay, so the sandpaper actually worked remarkably well, and I'm very happy with it. And it, because it's coarse, I don't know if you can tell, it leaves this really rough surface, what I actually really enjoy about that. Yeah. So I'm gonna go in, and I really like the weird, I don't want these to be perfect and shiny and smooth. That kind of defeats the purpose of it, and it's actually pretty sharp, honestly. So I'm gonna go ahead and rough out the shapes of all of these with that. Yeah, so let's go ahead and do that.
If I ever make ridiculous amounts of money, like enough money to pay for the royalties of one song, it would probably be the montage song from what is it? Swiss Army Man. Shout out to Carrots for showing me that movie. Anyway, so now we have moved to this smaller bit. There's probably a name for this thing. I don't know what it is. It's a small boy. And what I'm doing is using it to go in and make smaller, fine lines. With polymer clay, it's soft enough that I can take a needle tool and just scratch out the clay, or almost any other tool. And you technically could still do that with epoxy, but the likelihood that you're going to inadvertently stab yourself with the pressure you'd have to exert with a carving tool that I don't possess. I like my fingers in a relatively whole and hale quality, despite the fact that I'm probably doing, at any one point during the making of this, several dangerous things that I don't know about. But so far, I, still have all of my parts. So, yeah. This worked out pretty well. I did go back afterwards with a needle tool, which again is just it's like a big needle. You can get it in any craft store with the polymer clay supplies. and just dragged it along some of these grooves just to make it a little deeper. It didn't do a whole lot. Like I said, you have to apply a lot of pressure. In fact, you can see the black needle tool on the table anytime I put the tooth down away far enough. It is pretty beat up, so I use it for multi-purpose. I will stir up paint or epoxy with it. It's just a sturdy throwaway tool. It's good to have them because I mess up a significant number of tools. I also send many paintbrushes to an early graveyard because I don't clean them perhaps as well as I should, or I get distracted and then they dry. I am endeavoring to take better care of my paintbrushes, but we'll see when we get to the painting stage of this how many, if any, die. I don't pretend to be. I don't pretend to think that I'm not going to kill any immediately, but I will settle for a significant, or at least an improvement, a steady improvement in paintbrush wastage. Oh boy. Alright, so we're gonna speed this process up so we can get through the rest of these teeth. Yeah!
All right, while you guys are waiting, I went out and I got my nails done. Let's check them out. Ooh. Ah. I'm very good at what I do, but what I do isn't very nice. And that was a really bad reference and a horrible imitation. So all of our nails, our teeth, not nails, are done. And I've laid out roughly with a magic marker where these 8 teeth are going to go. There's going to be a ninth tooth. Number 9 is going to come out of this nose here. So our next step is to attach, to sand these down at the angle I'd like to attach them, epoxy them to the mask, then let that cure, then model some lip or gum around each tooth. And then of course, sculpt the 9th one on. All right, let us begin.
My stellar camera work aside, the tentative idea I'm working with here is to hold the tooth against the mask to try to figure out what kind of jaunty angle I want that particular tooth to sit at, and then sand the back of it at that angle so that it sits flush against the mask at that angle. Does that make sense? I'm really bad at explaining things sometimes. At work, I always tell people that while English is my first and mostly only language, I don't do a terribly good job at speaking it sometimes. I am going for something of symmetry here, where the angle of the outermost teeth will match and be pointed upwards, and the next closest in will be pointed downwards, with the third set being right underneath the eyes, being at a higher angle. This would make it so that the middle, or the 9th tooth, will be up high. As always, I am making this up entirely as I go. I usually don't know how I'm going to do something until I attempt to do it. This is probably the equivalent of lying to an employer when they ask you, do you know how to use this program? And you're like, yeah, sure, I totally know how to use that program. I am a master. Except that in that situation, you would probably go online and quickly look at tutorials should you be hired for the job. I, despite having the wealth of knowledge that is the entirety of recorded history basically at my fingertips, as a comedian Christopher Titus says, about 3 inches from my ass at all times on my person, I would rather fail and do things the hard way than see what other people are doing, because you know what, that takes time, and at this point with my motivation, I have to capitalize on the time that I'm willing to do something instead of risking the complete seduction that is looking up stuff only to get distracted by other things. And then, oh, it's 4 days later and I haven't gotten anything done. Well, anyway, you guys get the point, so let's skip up to the next piece. Yeah.
Well, if I haven't given myself away as a huge nerd, I hope this cinches it for you. Alright, so the next step is to drill a hole into the middle of each tooth and a corresponding hole into the mask. From there, I will run a sturdy but malleable wire through the tooth, through the mask. This is good for 2 reasons. One, it lets me fool around a little bit more with the angle still, if I'm not quite set on where I've roughly sanded it. If I find that the angle is too severe or the tooth is too long, I can sand it down or add some more epoxy, which is the glorious part of epoxy, is that it sticks and adheres to itself so well. And also the wire helps that it doesn't move from the position that I want it to be in when I finally decide on its final location. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. I have selected a bit that is roughly the width, oh wait, hold on. Aha! This one, which is roughly the width of here. And let's get to it.
Alright, it's time to permanently attach some stuff. Each tooth has been drilled into, has its own pin, and a corresponding hole drilled into the mask already. So our first step is to epoxy the pin to the tooth. Now initially I was going to use the epoxy I've been using to sculpt so far, but I had a 2-part steel epoxy resin that I had from a previous project I did for my father fixing a lawn ornament that's been kind of sitting unused. In fact, it's so old, the black tube that was on the left no longer opens from the top, and I had to cut the bottom off. So again, you probably shouldn't do as I do. You should probably wear gloves when you mix this, and there probably isn't the right application for this, but I am trying to use up the supplies that I have stored everywhere in my room that are collecting dust. So it ends up, spoiler alert, working out really well. So mix it up real well. You can pretty much eyeball it. No, at no point have I used this and met with bad results. You just want to make it close to 1-to-1 as possible. I dip each pin in, put it into the tooth, and really press against the table to make sure that the wires are way in there. I ended up switching to a slightly thicker and more sturdy wire. The first one I picked was a little too malleable for my purposes. The teeth are a little heavy, and I really wanted something a little bit more secure when I was testing out how I wanted it to look. So the steel resin mixes up just this side of thick. However, as it sets, it tends to run a little bit. So the next day after it was finished curing, I did have a couple teeth I needed to sand because they got a little stuck to the table. But I know for next time to try to wipe off a little bit more. And because by virtue of always mixing up more than I need, I had a couple of things that could use some TLC, namely this octopus I've sculpted inside of a seashell. He broke his tentacle off. I've been working on him off and on using leftover sculpting epoxy to add little bits and details to him. Also, I have this epoxy hand that I made, again, out of scraps left over. And I don't really have a purpose for it, and I kind of liked it though until I stepped on it and broke off 3 of the fingers. I still don't know what I'm going to do with it, but I figured I had all this leftover steel resin, so why not? And I was also able to fix my work ID, my little name tag, because it went in the washer where it should not go. And the pin back became disconnected, so I fixed that too. And now it will never come off, ever, 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 ever. All right, so all of the pins are attached to the teeth. It is now time to permanently affix them to the mask. So once all of the teeth are permanently attached to the mask, it will be time to enter the next stage of battle. Which really basically means break out the gray epoxy again, mix it up, make a gum or lip or whatever around the teeth. We're going to put a thin layer over almost the entirety of the mask and give it some texture. It'll help hide what I can't smooth out of the mask, and we can add some interesting details. And then from there, it's just prepping for paint. Painting is not my strongest suit. One of these projects I'd like to make about airbrushing. I'm not confident enough in it to do it here. I have a perfectly, well, what I assume is a perfectly functioning airbrush and airbrush paints and a compressor, and I've owned the compressor for about 2 years and I have never turned it on because I'm awesome. But it's okay. It's okay. See, if this is successful, then I will have a project, an experiment that will require me to experiment with it. So, good luck to me. Otherwise, I'll see you guys soon. Ciao.